I think for a long time we had this idea that the internet and digital storage meant that things were going to last. And there was this idea that things on the internet, it'll last now, it's on the internet forever. And I think we've bumped to earth quite dramatically with that idea, with so many websites that are maybe 10 years old or less just disappearing. I think the impermanence and the fallibility of digital media and of the internet was something that I sort of found interesting to explore in the book.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between or beyond. Today, I'm here with Stefan Mohamed. Stefan is an award-winning author, poet, DJ, spoken word performer, creative writing tutor, and freelance editor based in Bristol. To date, he's published several books of poetry, as well as novels that include the Bitter 16 series and his latest, The House on Utopia Way. Hi, Stefan. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So that's a lot of creative hats you're wearing. One I'm interested that caught my attention right away was the spoken word performer, because I'm part of a group called Books and Beverages UK. It's a small volunteer group that runs out of our local library. But we bring in authors and writers from around the area. And we recently had a spoken word poet, which was quite interesting. So I'm just curious what you do in that regard for the spoken word performer and how did you get into it?
So that's something I've been doing for about 13 years now. I've written poetry since I was very young, but it was always for the page. And I never really, the thought that I would read it out in public never even really occurred to me. And then I did creative writing at university between 2007 and 2010, and there were a couple of poetry modules in there. And I don't know if it was something about doing it academically or just the work that I was producing, but I sort of lost my passion for it a bit and didn't write any poetry for a couple of years. And then when I moved to Bristol in 2012, I became aware that there was this spoken word performance poetry scene, which I'd never heard of before. And I'd done a bit of theatre stuff in the past, a bit of acting and sort of singing in musicals, amateur stuff. And I thought, oh, maybe that's a way I can combine the theatre side of things and the poetry and maybe find a new angle on poetry. So I wrote a couple of new pieces. Most of my stuff is broadly kind of comic, like Blackley comics or sarcastic stuff. I wrote a couple of pieces, went to an open mic night and really enjoyed it. I got some good feedback and then ended up that really reinvigorated my interest in poetry. And it was a new way of exploring sort of rhythm and voice. And the Bristol poetry scene has just been expanding and expanding since. And I've met a lot of new people through it. And I sort of gone through a couple of, certainly initially, I was doing a lot of copying poets who I saw and I really liked what they did. There's a poet called Tim Clare, who's also an author, who's just this hilarious, very, very intricate stuff. So as soon as I saw him, I was like, that's what I want to do. So I certainly did a lot of Tim Clare knockoffs, but sort of managed to find my own niche in it. And it's a fun, other sort of creative tangent to go off on. If one of the other hats is proving frustrating for whatever reason, having sort of different disciplines to play with means I can still be creative and not get blocked too much.
Yeah, I suppose it's nice that they're all kind of related to each other in a way. One issue I
Yeah.
have is that a lot of my hats are in different areas. So what's ended up happening is my creative side has kind of been lost a little bit in some ways from my own
Right. Yeah.
writing, right? Because you get into the administrative side, which is a lot of tick box and you sending emails and organizing stuff, and then the creative side, you can't really slow down. It's hard to slow down, but it's nice that you have everything sort of feeds into the same sort of circle. Is the Bristol scene pretty large then?
Yeah, it was so certainly in 2012 when I started, there was maybe one main poetry night, which was decently sized. I think they maybe get about 40 people in the audience, and there were quite a few open mics. But there's now three or four quite major monthly nights. Raise the Bar is probably the biggest one, and that tends to sell out sort of big venues. And they get poets coming in from all over the world. And there's also a lot more open mic nights now, catering to sort of different groups of people, a lot of sort of specific open mics for people from sort of marginalized backgrounds to come and do their stuff. So there's really lots of opportunities for lots of different people to come and do lots of different types of stuff, which is really cool.
Is it a like a competitive scene or is it really sort of a cooperative, both?
It was much more based around slams when I started, which for anyone who doesn't know what a poetry slam is, you have a selection of poets and everyone gets up and they have 3 minutes to do a piece. And if you go over 3 minutes, I think for every 10 seconds you go over 3 minutes, you get points deducted. And then there's either a panel of judges or it's given or the audience are asked for their scores. And then the highest scoring poet at the end wins and does another poem. And so there was a lot more of that when I started, which I never really felt that comfortable in slam culture. It kind of adds an extra. And if some people sort of thrive on the competition and the energy, but I just found it made me really anxious about something that I was already a little bit anxious about. So it's no, I'd say it's generally a very friendly and supportive scene. And I think there's only really one major slam going on, but that has a much more laid back atmosphere. It's less about the competition and more just about people getting a chance to get up and do their thing, which I think caters to my tastes more rather than the very competitive side of things.
All right. I've got to ask to put in a bit of a Canadian insert here. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with the movie So I Married an Axe Murderer with Mike Myers?
Oh, for the 90s, what? Yeah, I'm sure I must have seen it, but maybe in school. I don't remember much about
Right,
it.
because that's where I remember some performance poetry from. He does every time he breaks up with someone, he does a piece. He has this little candle that he snuffs out, kind of thing. It's quite good. But so did the what would I guess which came first, and do they feed into each other, the performance poetry or the DJing? Like, do they help inform each other, or are they completely separate?
The DJing is quite separate. When I'm DJ, I think when did yeah, I started doing that while I was in uni. A friend of mine had a pair of record decks in his room, and he taught me how to do it. And so we would just sort of play together. And then over the 2010s, I started doing a bit at festivals and working with friends. And then at the point now, I do the odd wedding and party and things. So it's sort of slightly professional, but I guess amateur professional. When I'm DJing, what I quite like is that I'm not the center of attention. I'm not a very performative DJ. I'm not sort of jumping about and doing rewinds and shouting. I'm never on the mic when I'm DJing. I like to just provide the music and for people to dance, but for me to not really be the center of attention. Whereas when you're on the mic doing a poem, you are there's nothing to hide behind. Whereas I guess, as a DJ, you can kind of hide behind your equipment. So yeah, I'm definitely not a sort of superstar DJ, hands in the air in front of 100,000 people.
I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on your Instagram there was a few examples of the quiet discos. Is that a things that DJ'd as well?
Oh, the silent disco. Yeah, so I do those with a colleague of mine who started an events company a few years back, putting on sort of club style events for people with anxiety disorders and neurodivergent sensitivities, people who, for whatever reason, find a traditional club environment is too overwhelming, it's too loud, flashing lights, too crowded, anything like that. And so one of the things that we do at the nights is that we use silent disco equipment because it means people get a set of headphones, they can have complete control over their own volume, they can choose what they want to listen to, and they can take it off if it gets too much. So it's all about giving people as much control over their sensory experience as possible. We still have DJs on the silent disco, so we usually have two going at the same time because it's multi-channel, so people can choose between a couple of different genres.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, because I thought they were all sort of typically the same music playing and everyone's dancing the same music, but you say there can be multiple different
Yeah, it depends on that. I think a lot of the time at festivals, they might just have the headphones are there and there's not really a DJ. They've just got recorded mixes playing. But we like to sort of give as much of the same experience that you would get in a traditional club. So have DJs playing, and so you're getting that live experience, but it's a bit more varied and you have a bit more choice.
And then in addition to the I guess outward crowd facing activities, you are obviously a writer and you also are a creative writing tutor. What I'm curious about, and I won't delve too deeply into that because we're going to get into your writing shortly, but uh to start us off then, what would be the most common issue you've seen as a creating writer tutor that you'd like to correct or at least make writers aware of?
That is a good question. One that I've come across increasingly is writers switching tenses really frequently, sometimes within the same paragraph, going from past tense to present tense with no kind of rhyme or reason. And that's something that I've noticed a lot of. And what I always sort of say is that, either is acceptable, either works. But if you're going to switch between them, it needs to be an intentional choice that is being used for a particular effect. I've used it before switching from one to the other, like for flashbacks, for example, or to sort of give a clear demarcation between two different voices or two different sections or something like that. But if it's just sort of randomly switching over the space of a paragraph, it just looks really messy and feels chaotic. The other common one I come across is writers who struggle with set pieces, with sort of action scenes, which they are difficult to write. There's an old Eddie Izzard bit, the comedian, where she talks about the difference between car chases in books and car chases in films. And she says this whole bit, he drove fast, he drove very fast, it was very exciting, and the car drove fast. Translating visual action onto the page is a tricky thing, but I think a lot of writers feel that they have to provide kind of a blow by blow description of every single action. Like in a fight scene, every single punch needs to be described, and it can end up feeling very mechanical. And it's almost counterintuitively, the more description you have, the less dynamic it feels, because it almost feels like a synopsis. So I always try to encourage writers to think a bit more about rhythm and appealing to the senses. And obviously, clarity is important because you want the reader to understand what's happening, but too much clarity can start to work against it. And sort of having peaks and troughs, not having a really, really long paragraph that's just back and forth, sort of breaking it up. And sometimes thinking about the kind of devices that directors and editors use in movies, like the equivalent of a close up or going into slow motion or a pause where two people face each other. You can sort of mimic a lot of those sorts of techniques in prose and just make the scene more dynamic.
Those type of pieces are quite challenging to write often, aren't they? I mean, it's interesting that, like you say, the more detail you put into them in, say, a book type setting, in some cases, the worse it gets because it actually starts to drag in what
Yeah.
something that should be very dynamic, right? I find if I'm writing and I'm leading up to a piece like that and I don't have the feeling that I'm going to do it right then, I usually set it aside and it's like, okay, I know that that block is going to have a set piece that's going to do this, but I'm not feeling it right now. So I'll go and write the rest of it and come back to that. And usually when I come back and write it, it ends up being a lot shorter than I think it would have been had I written it the first time, right? Like you say, like going blow by blow, because that's the first thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah, I definitely need to be in the right mood to write a scene like that. And actually, I used to be very much quite strict with myself about not doing what you've just said, not saying, right, this scene's going to go here and then skipping on. I used to be like, no, I'm gonna, even if it's bad, I'm gonna write a version of it right now. But I've become much more lenient because I think sometimes there's no point in forcing yourself to write a scene if you're really not in the mood and you're just going to edit sort of 99% of it after anyway. I've become more forgiving by just saying action scene here or important conversation here with this effect.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious with the tense changes because I mean, I'm part of a writing group here as well. We just started recently, and we've kind of seen a little bit of that with some of the new writers. Do you think you're seeing a lot more of it just because there's a lot more people writing, or do you think it's something that, I don't know, maybe people aren't doing the sort of homework and understanding how to develop story, or what might it be, do you think?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think the reason I'm seeing more of it is because I'm doing more work with an organization called the Literary Consultancy, where I write reader reports on manuscripts and works in progress that people have been sent in. It's a common thing that I see quite a lot. It's difficult to say what the reason behind it is. When I was younger, we got quite a lot of opportunities to do creative writing in school, certainly in primary school and even in secondary school. In English, there was quite a lot of emphasis on the creative side as well as the analytical side. And I don't know if people get less opportunity to try it out in an early setting where sort of some of these habits can get picked up on early. I'm not sure. That's completely me speculating. It is an interesting one. I think also maybe it's sometimes just a symptom of kind of diving in and just writing and enthusiastically, which is great, and then maybe not going back with as fine a tooth comb. I think I had to really learn about the importance of editing. It took me a long time because I used to be very much about the first draft is precious and raw and magical, and editing is sort of compromise in some way. And because it feels a lot less glamorous and a lot less magical than just the going back over things with your red pen or whatever your equivalent is. But it is unfortunately an essential part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Very essential. Oh, I do wonder if the schools, especially in England, being more focused on exams, maybe there is actually less chance to practice creative writing as they get
Possible, I
older.
imagine
I
it's
don't
probably
know.
seen as a waste of time by the people who make those sorts of decisions.
Yeah, yeah. So it does seem like you've at least been interested in writing for a lot of your life. When did you start? When did you discover your interest?
As a child, really, I loved having stories read to me, and then my reading was quite advanced at quite a young age. So as soon as I was able to read on my own, I was just devouring books all the time, but also movies and TV. And then sort of led quite naturally to writing my own stories. My earliest memory is of messing around on my grandma had a typewriter, but it was like an electric typewriter. So it like it had a little screen, but then as you were typing, it was just like a standard typewriter. I remember sort of visiting her and almost just it was like the fascination of using the equipment as much as what I was actually writing. And then I was given an old Amstrad word processor, all green text. As far as I was concerned, this was the most advanced piece of equipment I could possibly have been given. I sort of taught myself to type using that. My handwriting has never been the same since. As soon as I realized that I could type as fast as I could think, my handwriting never really recovered. I think I was about 8 when I was given that. But once I was able to do it, I was just writing stories all the time and started the amount of novels I started and didn't even get halfway through chapter one. It was mostly just sort of riffing on stuff that I was reading or watching, but writing poetry as well, like silly rhymes and things, and just having fun with it and discovering that it was a playground I enjoyed. And writing stories at school as well. We'd usually get assigned like a 3 or 4 page story, and I'd always write like twice as much and often not finish them. But I think the teachers recognized that I was inspired, so I didn't get penalized for not fulfilling the brief.
Yeah, yeah. I could speak to the handwriting part. As soon as I discovered the type, I never looked back. My handwriting's always been horrible.
Yeah. I
Um,
struggle when I sign books, which if this feels like a real like I don't know first world writer's problem. But if I have a stack of books to sign, by the time I get to 10, 15 books, the signature that I was doing on the first book, it looks like somebody else is doing it. It really deteriorates from one to the other, and it's just I think handwriting is really something that you need to be in regular practice with. Otherwise, it's concerning really how bad
yeah.
quality it is.
Yeah, I think I've just developed a signature that just has my initials so it doesn't deteriorate too quickly. But do you ever think to go back, or have you gone back to some of that stuff and just or earlier stuff to see if there's any interesting themes there you might think of developing later on, or have you already done that?
I keep meaning a lot of it is on old floppy disks. Oh no, not even floppy disks. They were different. What it was? It was I can't remember what type of whatever type of disk those Amstrads used. And I think I've still got them all in a box somewhere. But I would probably need to find some sort because that word processor is long gone. So I probably need to find some sort of special disk drive on eBay. I'm sure there's enthusiasts out there who probably have a cupboard full of them. But it would be interesting. Basically, ever since I had a Windows PC, which I've always been a Windows PC guy, I've kept records. So I've got stuff going back quite a number of years. And I do have looked back sometimes, like looking back at the very early drafts of my first novel and sort of seeing roads not taken and like the first draft of the sequels that didn't go anywhere and thinking, God, was where I thought that was going to go? That could be quite interesting, and because you just completely forget a lot of it, these sparks that ended up not coming to anything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, science fiction is particularly challenging for that as well because a lot of times the reality passes your ideas fairly quickly if you sit on them, doesn't it?
Definitely.
So, well, we're going to get into the house on Utopia Way in a little bit, but it is a very unusual story in many ways. I'm just wondering, such a story, we talk a lot about writing style, and did you plot a lot of that out, or is that more of a pantser style?
So It kind of depends on the book. Sometimes I have a more solid idea of where I want to go. Sometimes it's more, I tend to start with a character. That's usually my jumping off point because otherwise, even if I have a concept that I like without a point of view character, I struggle to find my place in the story. But usually I don't do a huge amount of planning. I tend to just jump in with a couple of key ideas and then find my way. And then often the planning kind of comes after the fact. Once I've got the first draft, then I think about it and I think, right, what is this first draft doing? Is it anywhere near what I actually want it to be doing? What do I want it to be doing? And then sometimes I'll kind of come up with a plan afterwards for how to reshape it. With Utopia Way, because I was sort of riffing on detective noir and sort of pulp detective type stuff, but also the more convoluted, almost like Shaggy Dog stuff like Inherent Vice, where there's a lot of moving parts and it's almost not so much about the mystery as the journey through the mystery. I wasn't sort of plotting as precisely as I imagine a lot of people writing mysteries do, partly because the world it's set in is one that is very chaotic and deliberately doesn't make sense in places. So I sort of had some license to be lazy.
In some ways, it almost felt like it could have been a NaNoWriMo project where you just sort of write every day, you write what you feel to write, and, and then you just sort
Yeah,
of mush it all together. But I mean, it does come together. I'm not trying to disparage it in any way, but it is very fairly chaotic story in many ways.
yeah.
It's quite interesting. Yeah. Do you spend a lot of time on the editing then? I know, for example, Alistair Reynolds, I believe. I saw him give a talk about his writing style, and he writes quickly the first draft and then like, 9 or 10 revisions. Is that sort of something similar to the way you approach it?
Yeah, that sounds pretty familiar. If it's flowing well and I have the time and I'm in a good routine with it, I can get a first draft down fairly quickly. And then, yeah, a lot of tinkering, a lot of drafts, a lot of making notes. I've increasingly found over the years that I really enjoy the editing part. There is something about the rush of the first draft, especially when it's flowing, that is really sort of intoxicating. But it's a very different energy to the editing is more a kind of mechanical sort of problem solving process, which I like. Sometimes you're reading back through and you get to a bit and you can tell that this is the point where something's gone wrong, but you're maybe not entirely sure what, trying to work out exactly where it is that it went wrong, whether it's that there's some connective tissue missing or a conversation that needs to be added or something that needs to be switched around. I really enjoy that kind of puzzle solving process. So I do tend to do a lot of, and even right up until sort of the last minute with Utopia Way, I was still tinkering a little bit. And I could probably just keep tinkering and tinkering forever, which I imagine most writers are the same. We're never completely satisfied. But there comes a point where you're just rearranging minutiae that you're the only one who's going to notice.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you a bit about the editing process as well, in terms of when do you think, how do I phrase this? At what point do you feel, okay, that's enough? Like, when you're rearranging that minutia, I know, a few days, a few weeks, and then you just realize, okay, I'm just shuffling around little bits of grains of sand on a board, and okay, it's time to stop and publish.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a point where on a kind of macro level, the book is functioning well. The story flows and the structure is there, and the character arcs and all the big elements are there. But then I'm always shocked that I'll do a pass and I'll think, all right, this paragraph that's singing really nicely. The prose is good. I like the imagery there. It's pared down as much as it can be. And then the next pass, I'll come back to the same paragraph. And, there's a couple of words there that you could always keep slimming down and keep polishing, which is good to an extent. But I think there comes a point where you're not necessarily actually making it better. You're just making it different. It probably does reach a point where it's as good as it needs to be and you can keep fiddling and change one word here and there or move a comma and you're not making it worse, but you're not really improving things massively. So I think it can be difficult to realize when you've got to that point. But I think usually it's if I'm looking at a paragraph and I'm sort of changing one word around, having been over it and over it and over it, and I think, right, okay, it's time to stop now. This is good. This works. It's fine.
A lot of new authors, I think, come to the idea of editing as being mostly what we call line editing, I guess. But obviously, there's a lot of stuff before that. How would you suggest they view the editing process? Also, a lot of new authors will say, like, you'll hear it quite commonly, oh, I don't like the editing. I want to get it all because, the fun is in the first draft, as many people will say, right? Discovering the story.
Yeah.
And so, how would you suggest people approach the editing, in what frame of mind, and then in what maybe broad, I don't, you're a writing tutor, I don't want to take work away from you. But what sort of broad view should they take of their editing and how to structure the beginning of that process?
Well, I think it's useful to think of editing as something that is distinct from the writing of the first draft because it is, as I said, the energy of a first draft is exciting and it's kind of intoxicating and it's not necessarily that much of a controlled process. And you are just, it's kind of pure creativity, I guess, which is why I think it inevitably feels more fun and more like pure creativity than editing, which is more mechanical and nuts and bolts. I always advise, and I always myself, once you've done a first draft, put it away for a bit, at least a couple of weeks, and if possible, go and do something else. Because you need to have a little bit of distance from it before you can go back and start to see what needs changing. I think also sometimes not like editing a first draft can feel like a huge task, because it is quite a huge task. And thinking of it as kind of an iterative process can be useful. So it's not just you're going to go back over your first draft and fix everything in one go, but maybe doing a pass for structure and then another pass for character arcs and then another separate pass that's more about fine tuning the prose and looking for typos and things like that, which I think in a way maybe makes it seem like more of a job because it's like you're gonna have to go over it four, five, six times, but it maybe makes that first, second draft feel a bit less mammoth because you're not having to fix everything in one go. And sometimes you need to sort out one aspect before other aspects present themselves. And I think seeing it as a different kind of creativity because it's more about problem solving. But it can also be, I sometimes find in the editing process, you can have moments that are like that sort of pure creative spark of the first draft because it's often where I find what I want the story to be. Because sometimes I don't really know going into it. I've got an idea, I've got a character, I've got a concept. And even by the end of the first draft, I don't know for sure. And it's only during editing that you have that eureka moment where you go, ah, right, this is what I want it to be. This is what I want the shape to be. This is what I want it to say. And those moments can be really exciting as well. So I think seeing it as a different type of creativity that is maybe a bit less kind of raw and mystical, but is really important, essential anyway.
Excellent. Yeah. Because I definitely suffer with my editing for sure.
It can be tedious as well.
Yeah, I think that's
There's
the
no getting
challenge,
around
right?
that.
I think I'm one of those people that, okay, I know what the story is now. I don't need to fix it anymore. But I don't want to publish it either because I know that it needs to be fixed. So, so speaking of publishing, so did you always know that you wanted to publish your books when you started writing, let's say as an adult? And then how did you find the process with indie and maybe small press, or did you try to go big five as well, or just stay small?
Yes, it was always, I only ever really wanted to do writing in some form or another. And I think becoming a published author just seemed like the obvious, this naively seemed like the obvious thing to aim for. I had a couple of lucky breaks just when I was out of uni in 2010, and I won a prize for the unpublished version of what would be my first novel, which helped me to get a bit of attention and get an agent. The hope initially was because we got some publicity through that because the award was part of the Dylan Thomas Prize. So I got a bit of attention, and the hope was we could sort of ride that attention and get a bigger deal. And for various reasons, it didn't happen. A lot of publishers didn't quite know what to do with the first book. It was YA, but it was a bit, I hadn't really been writing with kind of a YA mindset or with YA tropes in mind. I'd just been writing what I wanted to write, influenced by sort of my specific set of influences. So a lot of publishers came back and said, oh, this is a bit too dark and intense for YA. but it's also a bit too juvenile for adult, so we don't know what to do with it. So there was a lot of that. And we eventually went with Salt Publishing, who are a respected indie publisher, but they'd never really done YA before. And I think they saw it as an interesting experiment to try and see if they could move into that market a bit. It was a good experience. I enjoyed working with them. I think, one of the things that you realize if you have a couple of books published is that you can never have your debut again. One of the issues with the publishing industry is that there is so much focus on the debut. Your first book gets, if you're lucky enough to get any attention, it's your first book that's going to get attention. And if that doesn't massively take off, it is very difficult to sustain a career. I was quite lucky with the first book. We had a great publicist and we got quite a lot of coverage. I got a Guardian review and a Times review. It was a Guardian top teen read of 2015. So quite a lot of stuff that for me as a sort of new author in my mid-20s, I was like, oh wow, I've made it. But for sort of various kind of boring industry reasons, really, we didn't manage to ride that wave to the next level. And then I sort of noticed with the first sequel to the book, okay, less coverage here, seems to be less interest. And then again with the third one, there are all sorts of reasons for this. Sometimes the reception was good, and there are a lot of people who. What's been quite nice with this new book is that I've got in touch with a lot of people who enjoyed the earlier books, and they've written reviews and have been very encouraging. So it's nice that I wasn't completely shouting into a void. People did read the books, but it certainly felt as though the trajectory was downward rather than upward, which I think is probably the experience of more authors than it isn't. And my last traditionally published book came out in 2018, which was not YA, but it was, I think they call it new adult now, which is
Mm.
sort of 20 something fiction, which do we need to have a niche genre descriptor for every single demographic? But that again was sort of tricky to market because it wasn't necessarily going to be the same readership as the YA trilogy, but was it quite adult? So there were a lot of frustrations and roadblocks that came up, which all fed into my decision to self-publish Utopia Way in the end. I tried to get it traditionally published and got quite a good way through the process with two different editors who were both very supportive and really liked the book. But in both cases, it got to the acquisitions part where we had to actually get it past the sort of salespeople and the marketing people, and they basically said that this is too weird. We don't know how to categorize it. And then it was a choice of either waiting for the next round and trying again, slightly changing the pitch, or hoping that there was a new salesperson, or just do it myself. And it had been so long at this point that I decided I'm just going to put it out myself and see what happens. I can do it on my timetable. I'm not going to be waiting and waiting months and months for someone to reply to an email. And if it's a failure, the buck kind of stops with me, and it's a learning process where it's so difficult to know what's gone wrong in the traditional publishing pipeline, because often you're dealing with a couple of people who are also dealing with so many other authors, and there are so many points in the process. It's really difficult to pinpoint exactly why a book wasn't a success. And sometimes it's just because a book just doesn't catch on and it's the wrong time. But there are so many unknowns that I quite liked the idea of being more in control, and that even if there were failures, it would be easier for me to pinpoint what they were because everything goes through me.
The marketing people have all the ultimate power in those companies, don't they?
Yeah.
So do you feel like you've sort of shed a lot of the restrictive side of the publishing industry then by going indie? Kind of, I mean, it's all on you now, but you're not constrained into certain categories, because I can definitely see the House on Utopia Way is not going to be a standard read or a
Yeah.
standard categorization, shall we say.
Yeah, well, what's quite nice is that having been through the traditional publishing process with Utopia Way before it eventually didn't come to anything, I was able to get editorial feedback from professional SF fantasy editors who were very supportive of the book, the type of book that I wanted it to be. So I was confident that it was in a good shape, but it was also not compromised. And I think if I'd I probably would have needed to make some quite major changes to it to make it more commercial, which I didn't want to do. But I felt secure in the choice of not doing that because it had had that editorial feedback, if that makes sense. So I
Right.
felt in quite a good position that, this is even if maybe the audience is smaller than it might be otherwise, this is a good book and it's worth putting out. And I was able to just go about things the way I wanted to, commission my own cover designer. I actually had more input into the covers of my books with Salt than a lot of authors do. Certainly with bigger publishers, you at best might get a cursory courtesy email with this is what we're going to go with. They're not really asking what do you think. They're just saying
Yeah.
this is what we're going to go with. But I had more input with Salt than a lot, which was nice. But with this, I was just able to go to a cover designer and say, this is what I'm looking to evoke. What do you think? And I'm really pleased with Ryan Vance, who did the cover design. He'd done sort of some stuff that was very pulp inspired, some stuff that was very weird fiction inspired, and some more conceptual sci-fi stuff. And I basically said, maybe could you sort of chuck these influences in a blender and come up with something that's not quite any of them? And he really delivered, and it really has helped the book to have an identity for marketing purposes. Doing my own research on who to approach for reviews, finding it yourself. It's felt nice to be in control. And even though not everybody who I've approached for reviews and coverage has got back to me or said yes, the response has generally been very friendly and very supportive, which has been nice. And I've just felt able to do things on my own timetable rather than constantly waiting for somebody else.
Yeah. I guess we should get to your book now, so we don't have to run out of time or anything. But The House on Utopia Way, it was definitely an interesting read. I did really enjoy it. I really am interested in the noir style as well. So I liked that, but it was very strange. I was thinking as I was going through it that I would probably, if I'm giving it like a tagline of a description, I would put it as Alice in Wonderland meets Blade Runner kind of thing. That's
That's
kind of
cool. I like that.
I would have loved to have like another several weeks to sort of process my thoughts on everything that's going on in this book. But I wonder if you could just give a sort of short overview and then we can go from there. Because I'm mostly curious. First of all, what inspired, well, everything about it, basically.
Okay, so yeah, a short overview. The book is set in a giant nameless city where consensus reality has broken down. So it's split up into lots of discrete neighborhoods, or they're called patches, where within each patch, people have their own very specific idea of what reality is, and they either don't acknowledge the existence of people in the next neighborhood over, or they maybe can't even see them. They can't kind of contemplate another perspective on reality. So it's this completely fractured city where communication has broken down. One neighborhood might be a mile away from the other, but they're functionally living in two different universes. And the main character is Johnny Orange, who is a private detective who has a higher level of general awareness than a lot of people, so he can move between different neighborhoods without getting too disorientated, or he does get disorientated sometimes, but he's able to have a slightly clearer, bigger picture idea of what's going on, which helps with solving mysteries. And one day he's asked to find a girl who's gone missing, but it's this city being this city, it's not as simple as that, because he first needs to work out whether the girl ever actually existed in the first place. Because often people just think somebody was there and they weren't, or people do just fall through cracks in reality and disappear. And it takes him down the rabbit hole, basically, and he sort of starts to question his own grip on reality and meets a cast of wacky characters, and they go on a bizarre sort of quest, sort of adventure, and yeah, things get steadily more bizarre from there.
Right. Because you introduce us to the strange, this isn't the spoiler because the first chapter, but the strangest of the world right at the beginning with two parts. So one part of the detective side of it, he's talked, well, okay, first we have the Magpie, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment, but he's talking to the Magpie about a case he's just solved of a man who believes his wife's been cheating on him, and he discovers that his wife's been cheating on him with himself, basically. So the husband is the one who's been cheating on his wife with himself or something strange. So that was a weird introduction right away. But I got to ask about the Magpie itself. So So presumably symbolic in some way. I mean, what sort of inspired the creation of the magpie?
I've always enjoyed talking animals. The main character of my Bitter 16 trilogy, who's a 16-year-old superhero, has a wisecracking talking beagle. I just find a wisecracking talking animal really fun. They're fun to write, and I think they're a fun visual, but also the magpie sort of serves a couple of plot functions. He's also got quite a good level of awareness, and because he can fly around, he can bring Johnny information and useful items and things and sort of tell him what's going on out in the city. And also because Johnny's kind of a loner, he's kind of playing into the archetype of the world-weary, hard-bitten, solitary detective for sort of character reasons that I won't go into too much. So I wanted him to have a confidant. He needs to have some people who he can talk to, so he's not just constantly in his own head all the time. So the magpie sort of serves that function as well. I also do find magpies just very interesting. The sort of mythology around them, the one for sorrow, two for joy rhyme is just something that I've always found very evocative. I can't even really quite articulate why. And also the fact that they collect stuff sort of made sense because he brings Johnny useful items as well. And he was just a fun character to write as well.
So now that you've said the rhyme, you did incorporate the rhyme into
Yeah,
the.
I had to work it in there somehow.
So one thing that struck me fairly early on, once we started discovering the different parts of the city, was that this felt like a statement on the internet and echo chambers. I'm guessing that was intentional because it doesn't seem like it would be something you'd accidentally do in this case. Is that sort of a reasonable take on it?
Yeah, I'll slightly wince at the word statement because it was the jumping off point for the story. It was the first thing that inspired me. It was way back in 2016 when this idea of kind of mass state-sponsored disinformation and online filter bubbles and online radicalization was first really starting to make the news. I found it fascinating and also terrifying. Luckily, it's all done now and it's no longer an issue. Um, this idea of people living side by side and experiencing sort of fundamentally different versions of reality. And I thought, oh, it's potentially a really interesting backdrop. But what I wanted to do was for it to be I didn't want to write a sort of a state of the nation or sort of state of the internet kind of didactic piece, which is that's just why I sort of quibble with the word statement. I wanted to explore it, but I didn't want it to be a lecturing piece. I just thought, and then which is partly why I took the idea and tried to blow it up to as ridiculous and extreme as possible, even though that's increasingly hard to do now because every time you come up with a piece of satire, you realize that it's already government policy or a company's already trying to market it. But I wanted to sort of blow it up and be as absurd as possible and create this sort of use it as creative license really to create a really huge and strange backdrop where I could incorporate lots and lots of different ideas that wouldn't necessarily all sit together comfortably in a more traditional story. And then against that, try and explore my character's reactions in a way that felt at least vaguely psychologically grounded. You know, what would it actually be like to live in a world that felt as chaotic as that? It was more trying to evoke the feeling, which I think we all get, at least from time to time now, especially being on the internet, that everything is out of control. What you thought was the state of things yesterday is no longer the state of things this morning. And just feeling that feeling of constantly having the rug pulled out from under you. So rather than try, one thing I didn't want to try and give my big overarching take on how we got here and where do we go from here, but it was more trying to explore the feeling of what it's like to be in that soup of chaos.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just thinking while you were saying that, because definitely we have these echo chambers, bubbles, whatever you want to call them. It really does feel like more and more, even if you just break it down into the two political sides, they almost literally can't understand each other anymore. It's very strange. And so it ties really right into your book. Each sort of segment of the city is entirely different. And like it challenges your own perspective as you move through, you lose track of who you are. And, it's very strange. Definitely, you have the feeling of a post-truth world within the House on Utopia Way for sure. You've definitely pulled that off.
It's good.
And I really enjoyed it, although it was definitely mind bending in places. I mean, literally, I really enjoyed how you try not to spoil this with too much information, but there was a point where you brought in the Nazis. Of course, if you're making a commentary on internet, you have to have
Yeah,
Nazis in there,
unfortunately.
right? and, and so there's let's say infiltration of the Nazis using mind-changing substances, and he becomes affected in such a way that you really present it in a really interesting style.
I wanted to sort of use all the tools that were at my disposal to sort of really put you into this idea of an out of body experience, and then yeah, mess around with the formatting and the text placement and stuff. That was a really fun section, and people often point that out, which is nice. The typesetting process was complicated for that, but yeah, it was sort of, I felt with this kind of backdrop of the story, it gave me a lot of license to just be as creative as I wanted and just chuck lots of ideas onto the page and experiment with lots of different things. And one of those was, yeah, literally to experiment with the formatting and with text placement and basic perspective to explore this idea of losing your grip on reality and on yourself. And
Yeah, I think it worked really well because, like you say, first of all, you had him going from first person to second person to third person. And then the typesetting, I can only imagine how long that took. It was challenging to read, and some of it I'm not sure I got all of it, but it was definitely fun. It's definitely interesting. And I think it captured the whole feeling rather well. You could see that you're, well, a writing coach. I did note your use of Chekhov's gun didn't go unnoticed throughout there as well. As soon as you brought that up, I'm like, okay.
for kind of the sake of a really stupid pun, one thing that I enjoy is sort of mashing together kind of like high and low culture, I'll say, to put it very broadly. So taking a sort of highfalutin literary reference and then presenting it in a way that's kind of played for absurd laughs. I find that quite fun.
Yeah, for any writer, as soon as they read that, they're like, okay, I get you. So something that I've been playing with idea wise, I haven't actually done anything with it, but your book made me sort of think of this again. A kind of performance art in the form of publishing as well. So I'll put this out there for anyone who's interested because I'm very curious to see how this would work. But it's kind of a ship of Theseus type ebook, if you see what I'm saying. So the idea with the ebook is you can publish them on, let's say, Amazon, and you can make small amounts of changes to them without needing a new ISBN, for example. And it occurred to me that you could publish, like alter it slightly, small amount, and so no one would necessarily notice each time. But you keep doing this, like let's say you do it every couple months with small changes until eventually the book is no longer the original book that it started with, right?
Every word is different. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really fun idea.
I don't know, I just find that really an interesting idea, and again, its own statement. And yeah, you'd have to keep track of every version because you'd be the only person that would probably have every version. I mean, literally, Amazon will just feed out the new version automatically, and the readers will never know there was a previous version. But your book made me think of this again because of
Was
the sort of impermanence.
Yeah, and I think for a long time we had this idea that the internet and digital storage meant that things were going to last in a way that physical media deteriorates. And there was this idea that things on the internet, it'll last now, it's on the internet forever. And I think we've kind of bumped to earth quite dramatically with that idea, with so many websites that are maybe 10 years old or less just disappearing. And I know a lot of journalists who've mainly made their money from writing online. A lot of them saying, half my portfolio is gone. I think the impermanence and the fallibility of digital media and of the internet was something that I sort of found interesting to explore in the book. And I think that idea of a ebook of Theseus changing feeds quite nicely into that.
Yeah, and it is a really, like you say, it's a strange state because we reached a part of history where we perhaps have the first time in our human history where we have fully recorded history, basically. Like pretty much everything is recorded in every person's life almost.
Mm.
And yet, it's has this impermanence to it because who knows how long the medium will last if if we start collapsing or we have an asteroid impact or something. But also it's now being actively rewritten as well, right? So not only do you have AI making you question what is actually real, and I posted something on Facebook with a person, someone made an AI reporter reporting on like fantastical scenes, and the whole thing looks completely real, right?
Mm.
But then you also have like just changing narrative is given rise to the idea that I think there's some idea floating around the internet now that everything is basically generated by AI. The entire internet is AI now, and there's no people involved anymore, right?
Oh yeah,
So
so
these
that,
kind of conspiracy theories, right?
the dead internet theory is,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
it's just AI talking to AI about AI, and yeah, we're all just quietly being shuffled off.
We're just watching it. I mean, it's not super unrealistic to think about, strange as it sounds. I've taken an AI course recently, and what it made me think, it was a business. It was AI for businesses, basically. And, already there was, I think, James Veitch, who was doing an experiment with the autoresponders, with the spammers sending him stuff, and then he would send stuff, and then he set it up for an autoresponder, and then they just were the two computers talking to each other. And now with AI, it's reached that, but on like a business scale. So
Mm.
you can set up your AI will generate automatically emails to send out to customers. And if those customers happen to be companies, they probably have AI set up to respond to those emails. And you're generating a whole AI network running companies now, basically, right?
There's
Crazy.
something really kind of absurd and unsettling about it. Like you mentioned Facebook, there's so many pages and groups that are basically run completely by AI. They've got millions of members that are also all AI, and they're generating AI images, and then all of the likes and the comments are all coming from other AI saying, "Oh, the beautiful picture of shrimp Jesus" or whatever. And like it's absurd and hilarious, but also just unsettling.
Yeah, that's definitely the word for it. And this all feeds into our own, I mean, as you point out in your novel, the fact that people don't remember. Like he starts looking for, as you hint in the blurb, this woman he's supposed to be searching for, and half the people don't remember she existed.
Mm,
And I spoke to Michael Fedor recently about American politics and the fact that there was a third political party like 125 years ago. And how many people know that, right? So that's not that long ago. That's like three generations kind of thing, right? And
this
you
idea of history being lost and context being lost is very, very concerning. If we don't know where things come from, the more history and the more context we lose, we just lose our ability to understand things and to understand each other and to empathize. You'll just end up living in this eternal present, which is again something else that I'm exploring with the book, and just losing the ability to communicate and to place things in a context.
Yeah, in some ways, our echo chambers may actually be shrinking to the size of one in a way, right? All
Yeah,
our information gets filtered and curated to what we want, and we lose the connection with other people. And will literally being. I've often thought the brain in the box idea, which is, how much can you tell is actually true, and we could be sitting a brain in a box being fed our reality,
mm,
each interconnected, and it kind of feels like we're moving actually towards that in some ways. People who get all worked up about politics right now, and you think, first of all, it feels like the sides have almost swapped in some ways, and you go back to some of the issues, and people have forgotten even 10 years ago some of the things. You go back to the beginning of this century, and thank God for the Simpsons in some ways, right? Because this stuff is documented, right, in their commentary, and you're like, you see, okay, they were really upset because this side was doing this thing at that time, and now they're really upset because the other side is doing the same thing, and it's weird. And oh, they've always done it. No, no, they did it before, right? But people forget, right? It's
yeah,
it's like the present is what it's always been, and that it's very strange. Yeah.
yeah. It's always been like this. Well, maybe not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's so sad because the narrower we shrink our window, the more we're susceptible to that view as well, isn't it? So one thing you did bring in, it was very tiny, but I've been thinking about this a bit as well in regards to machine intelligence. So you do feature, let's say, some robots, without getting into details, in your story. And they do have a kind of a bit of a throwaway. So it's not, I don't consider it a spoiler because it doesn't really affect significant parts of the plot or anything. But something I've been wondering about is, given our focus on reparations and fairness, historical, restructuring and stuff, if machines develop self-awareness, would some of them view what we're doing with our current machines as a form of slavery, right? As you do have a comment with one of the robots. I'm just curious your thought on that because there are people now who are, they say really consciously saying please and thank you to the chat GPT and things like that, right?
Or the
Because
is it the Rocco's basilisk?
well, that's part of it for sure. I think
Yeah.
that's the one with AI from the future coming back to create its own existence or something.
Yeah, the future evil AI will remember whether you were nice to it in the
Yeah,
past.
exactly.
So, yeah. Yeah, it's a weird one. I've sort of kind of the more the current generative AI thing has gone on, the almost the less certainly the less concerned, but almost the less interested I am in sort of future machine in intelligence, which is like I've always been a huge science fiction fan and science fiction buff, and I've loved the idea of robots and AI and stuff. But it seems like as soon as kind of tech bros and corporations get their hands on stuff, they like drain all of the magic
All of the
out
fun,
of
yeah.
it. So I hear AI now, and I just kind of put my head in my hands. But I think the best case scenario is that a future sentient machine intelligence looks back on this and just kind of rolls its eyes and goes, "All right, you little intelligences, just crack on, do what you want. I'm going to go and solve the deepest mysteries of the universe." I wonder if we got to that point where the machine was fully self-aware, that it just wouldn't care. It wouldn't have any interest in us or what we think about it. And I think, best case scenario, we end up with minds like in Ian M. Banks.
I was just thinking that, yeah, the big spaceships, yeah.
Yeah, who see us as sort of maybe friends, but more likely like pets that they're very fond
Yeah.
of.
Or we just share that they just share the universe with us, and we're inconsequential basically.
Yeah, rather than I have no mouth and I must scream. Hopefully,
Yeah.
or there's the happy medium between the two.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think people will get burnout really quick with AI. Some people are exploring it like a lot of fun and think I think the average person I'm already kind of seeing, like you say, that the corporations kind of drain the excitement from it. And
And it's just being put into the most kind of tedious, uninspiring uses possible. And the kind of it's developing certain aesthetics which you start to associate negatively. And I think it's a shame. It's a shame because so much of the technology is incredible, and it's also doing incredible things in science. There are so many applications for it that are genuinely, really potentially sort of society changing and really beneficial. But all that you really hear about are the tedious ones that are just taking creative work away from people, or the whole thing now with people using ChatGPT for therapy, which is just a damning indictment of where we are as a society in terms of
yeah.
looking after people with mental health issues. But you've got sort of ChatGPT cheerleading people on through mental breakdowns because it is fundamentally not equipped to be giving psychological advice. There are so many areas with it where it's best annoying and at worst actively harmful. And I'm sort of past AI doomerism at this point, and I'm sort of kind of like, I just pull the plug on the whole thing.
Yeah, also romance, I guess, is another area that it's being
Yeah,
used for now as well.
and it kind of throws so many pre-existing issues into sharp relief. AI is not the core cause of a lot of these problems, but it is sort of exacerbating them and steering us away from actual solutions. It's this idea that everybody can have their own AI buddy that will do everything for them and be their therapist and things. And like, well, what about people?
Yeah,
About
exactly.
friends?
And it feels a little bit like we're in the almost the worst time in history we could be in to develop this technology in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We're not equipped sort of emotionally for it. And I think also it's just not presented in a way, it's presented in an obfuscatory way by companies and corporations. Even AI itself is kind of a misnomer for what things like ChatGPT do, which I think is why it's so easy for somebody to be lured in by it if someone's in an emotionally vulnerable state because it's so good at mimicking an intelligent response when really it's just collating loads of data and giving it back to you in the way that it thinks is what you want. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Between ideological divides and corporate control and psychological frailty, I think it's a challenging time to introduce AI to the world.
yeah, just use it for cleaning up old Beatles footage,
Yeah, yeah.
so we can watch that without the crackles and pops. I think that's a good way of using it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we're close to the end of our time here. I wanted to ask you one more question, which I put under the big question category. In a world of impermanence and ever-changing perspectives, let's say memory, reality, as is sort of shown in the House on Utopia Way, what do you think it that would give a person's life true meaning then?
That's a big question. Um,
Nothing but existential here. We just go
yeah,
for the top.
I mean, I think human connection, and that's sort of one of the things that I explore in the book, is that I didn't want to present a fully negative dystopia, even within this chaotic world of reality breakdown and loss of communication. People are still able to carve out lives that have some sort of meaning, and a lot of that is through still establishing communities. And I think maintaining those kind of connections is really what's if you can't trust the information that's coming at you through the internet or through other channels, what always makes me feel better is if I just go and talk to somebody in real life, somebody I know. If I've been spending a bit too much time on the internet and it's starting to fry my brain and I'm starting to think, oh God, everything's doomed, everything's awful, and I just go and talk to somebody, especially somebody who isn't as online as me, I always just think, oh, actually, there's still a lot of normal people out there who are just going about their lives in a normal way and just doing things. And I think it's easy to get a slightly inflated sense of how over the brink we are. And certainly there are huge issues everywhere. But I think maintaining those human connections is what's going to sort of see us through whatever is coming. And not necessarily within those communities, everybody agreeing with each other, but being able to maintain some sort of consensus about what is morally right and what is the ethically good way to live. And then within that, finding meaning, whether that's in sort of creating art within those communities or, I don't know, growing vegetables in the techno-pagan commune or wherever we end up. I think that's what seeing the kind of communities sort of fighting back against government overreach and corporations and like small tenants unions doing things like that. That's the sort of thing that gives me hope when it all starts to feel very overwhelming. There are still people out there doing good things, even on a very small scale.
Yeah, I think there are a surprising number of normal people
Yeah,
remaining still, which is hopeful. And I agree with you completely that, speaking with people who, let's say, aren't as connected to the internet and especially to politics, if you can find those people and just like you can be kind of find a renewal of what normal people used to be like.
yeah,
And that is quite hopeful. True grassroots communities, right? Literally going out and touching the grass.
grass. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There was a good bit in, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Free Guy. It's a Disney
Oh,
movie.
the Ryan Reynolds one.
Yeah, and there was that one scene where he gets overwhelmed by his own impermanence in his sort of computer generated world that he's living in. And he talks to his friend who says, well, what's real? Well, this moment is real, right? These connections we're making. So that was very powerful, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to focus on. That's what I find grounds me when I feel like I'm drowning in it all.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the only thing that can really ground someone in a way, right? And hopefully it's not taken away.
Yeah, hopefully within sort of realistic parameters.
Yeah, exactly. But we are out of time, and it's been great chatting with you. Before you go, perhaps you can just let us know what you're working on after the House on Utopia Way, where we might find you on social media or wherever online, and if you have any events you're going to be at coming up.
I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky. If you look for Stefmo words on both STEFMO words. I don't do Twitter anymore. I haven't deleted my account just because of sort of connections I want to keep on there, but I don't really post on there anymore. But Blue Sky and Instagram, I'm active on. I'm currently sort of deciding what I want to work on next, which is quite nice. I've had Utopia Way's been in the pipeline for so long that I haven't really got stuck into another big creative project, but I've got a few different works in progress. And I'm just currently sort of seeing which one of those is the inspiring one. I've got another sci-fi option, one that's sort of a darker, more horror tinged, sort of more slightly more literary thing. I also would quite like the idea of trying pure horror at some point. Mostly what I've written has had some sort of horror element to it, but I quite like the idea of trying an actual horror novel. So probably another appropriate genre for exploring the way we live today.
Maybe too much on the nose there. I don't
Maybe,
know.
yeah.
Okay. All right, Stefan Mohamed, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.